This down, getting some feedback. Okay, is that okay? Ooh, that's still loud. Okay. All right, welcome to today's workshop. The weather is nice, midterms are coming, so it's kind of a small crowd, that's fine. Also, of course, assessment is usually not an interesting issue. I mean, it's kind of interesting to maybe education people like me, but most people find it kind of dry. But anyway, you got the handout, and there's actually, on the website, there's actually a full version of this, which was, of course, not provided to you. But, you know, on the top of your handout, there's a URL for my website, and you can fish around the website, and there are handouts. Of course, every week there are extra handouts, and there's actually a full version. It's kind of a booklet on assessment and grading and rubrics. So there's a lot more stuff in that handout. This is about a 10-page little booklet. So if you are interested in more, you can go to the website. Also, if you're a grad student and you haven't done our survey yet, we have a survey back there. So after today's session, you can pick up a survey, fill it out, bring it back to us for 5001 gift certificate. And it takes about half an hour. You need to fill out all of the required items on that, but we will give you a gift certificate if you bring it back to the CTL next door. Okay, if you're a grad student and you haven't done it yet. You can either do the paper version back there, or on my website there's a link to an online version. Okay, so today's topic is assessment. So I'm going to see a short video. Maybe you could turn out maybe the lights, and let's take a look.
One minute please. Time, thank you. You all please put down your pens and bring your papers to the front. Thank you. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, too late. Take a pity point about time. You failed. Sorry. Excuse me, do you know who I am? I have absolutely no idea. Good.
Okay. Some commercial, I have no idea what. All right, thanks. You can turn on the light. And so, what does that show about traditional test taking? Maybe you should talk to a partner. Actually, this is kind of small, but we got one more person coming in. So maybe, if you could maybe listen together, we could like pair up, and if you could briefly talk for a minute, because I also want to do a couple of other discussion things. So find a partner, pair up with somebody, and talk about what this video shows about traditional test taking. Okay, so what were your thoughts? If you could repeat some of the problems that this shows with traditional test taking, traditional testing.
No interchangeable between the professor and students in a paper and passing. So whatever you know, and you have to produce every single point of knowledge, you have to produce that.
Mm-hmm.
No question, no answer, just
Mm-hmm. Okay.
When testing how good your memory is, memorizing ability.
Okay. Maybe it's a test of, yes, your recall ability, not actual knowledge, not actual meaningful learning. That's a problem with traditional testing. So we don't know what kind of questions were on here, but so like a number 2, actually there's some kind of very traditional test items, like multiple choice. Are multiple choice items good test items?
Sometimes, yes or no.
Sometimes. What's the problem with multiple choice items or true false? These are often called objective test items because supposedly they are objective. Multiple choice, true false, kind of simple questions like that. Are those really objective?
Guessing. Students can guess.
Okay, when students can guess, they can see items on a multiple choice question. Can you move up further so I don't have to use the microphone? Don't be shy. Yes. Yeah, join the party. Yes. Multiple choice items, true, false, those kinds of things often rely on passive recognition, your ability to passively recognize something. So that's one problem. They really do not get at students' actual understanding. They don't really usually they don't measure students' understanding unless you have a follow-up question that says, explain your answer, explain why you chose your answer. So unless there's some kind of a follow-up that makes them explain in an open-ended kind of way, multiple choice items are often poor items. They're often what we call knowledge display questions. It's the same as if I'm asking you questions in a class, if I'm teaching you a class and I say, okay, what year did the War of 1812 start? That's a hard one, right? Who wrote, this book? Who wrote? They're just factual questions, things you should have memorized from the textbook or from the lecture, but they show no actual understanding of concepts. It's just what we call, this is a term we use, regurgitating. Sounds kind of bad, but in education this is what we use. You're just regurgitating information. Regurgitate means to like vomit, or throw up, or when sometimes food from your stomach tries to come back up, also, and it doesn't quite come out as vomit. I know this is gross, but in education, this is how we describe these kinds of questions. They're often regurgitation questions or knowledge display questions. And so it's only a test of superficial knowledge display. So, can you all hear me without the microphone? Yes. I'm not using the microphone today. That's good, because I can use my hands more easily. They're also not objective questions because really a teacher could make easier multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, or really, really hard, arbitrary questions about really minor, irrelevant details. In that sense, they're not necessarily objective, because as a teacher, you could just decide to make, I'm going to make easy multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, or hard, really, really hard ones. In which case, either way, you're not really necessarily testing actual understanding, conceptual knowledge, just facts, recalling facts. So that's not objective necessarily. It could depend on how easy or hard the teacher arbitrarily wants to make it. It might depend on the teacher's mood. Maybe you're angry at the students and you say, I want to make them suffer. I'm going to put a bunch of really hard multiple choice physics problems or something. Close is kind of similar. It's kind of you blank something out and maybe they have to choose between two alternates. That may or not be good. How about dictation? Especially in language teaching, is dictation, if any of you are in language teaching, some of you probably suffered under dictation when you learned English, right? Is that a good way of testing language knowledge for a language class? Dictation. Okay. Usually, is there a pedagogical rationale for making students reproduce a text word for word, letter by letter? Is there a real rationale for that? Probably not, unless you're doing very beginning level and you're trying to teach spelling or spelling and pronunciation. But otherwise, dictation has been greatly overused in Korea for teaching English or languages. If you are into language teaching and you want a better alternative, there's something that's much better that came about with modern teaching methods. It's called dictogloss or dictocomp. Gloss is the Greek word for language. So some people call it dictogloss, some people call it dictocomp, as in composition. So instead of having to reproduce something word for word, what I might do as a teacher is I'll take an interesting passage, something that's kind of interesting to the students. If it's middle school students, it might be an interesting passage about some new science discovery or about planets or about Mars or something that would be interesting and cool to them. So I read this paragraph aloud, maybe a couple of times, and the students take notes. They're not trying to write down word for word, but they take notes. And then after this, what you can have the students do is either work individually or in groups. More often this is done in groups, where they get together in a group and they kind of put their notes together, and from their notes they collectively create a summary or a paraphrase of what you read aloud. And that's more of a realistic test of their language ability than a dictation. Dictation is not a good test usually of language ability except spelling. So a dictocomp or dictogloss is a good option for language teaching, especially lower to intermediate levels. Problem-solving questions do you think problem-solving questions are good questions?
To the advanced level of students is really good, but it depends, but lower level of students actually problem-solving questions are really difficult because cognitively demanding.
Okay. The fact that it's cognitively demanding is perhaps a good rationale for using it, because it does make students show that they understand something, whether it's a physics problem, a medical problem, or a history kind of case study problem or whatever. And likewise, essay questions, problem-solving questions. You can give credit for partial understanding if they show they understand the concepts but they made a mistake or whatever. And again, we'll talk in a minute about how to do more specific detailed grading for things like a lot of things that are a little more open-ended or closed, like problem-solving questions. How about math story problems? Do you remember these from your earlier school days? A train leaves Busan traveling westward at 80 kilometers an hour. Another train leaves Seoul eastward at 60 kilometers an hour. Where are they going to meet? You remember those kinds of questions? Yeah, we had these all the time when I was in grade school and middle school. I hated them. We all hate them. Is there a good reason for doing that? These math story problems? And at the back of this handout, I've got a few cartoons that kind of poke fun at them. For example, only in math can you buy 60 cantaloupes. Nobody asks what the heck is wrong with you. Why would you buy 60 cantaloupes? So that kind of shows a problem that a lot of these traditional test items really have no connection to reality, to how the students would really use this problem. In fact, there's a great physicist named Richard Feynman, who one time was asked to, do you know Richard Feynman? He was a very famous quantum physicist. He was in California, and one time he was asked to look at some high school math textbooks, and he looked at them and he said, these are terrible. It's a terrible way of teaching math, because he's a math expert. And one thing was that the problems really had no connection to practical application. What are practical applications in the real world or in engineering or in physics for these math concepts that you're learning? These are totally boring problems, and I think he did a good job of basically showing that those kinds of problems are dumb. So those are some kinds of problems with assessments. This is not on here, but think about the TOEFL, TOEIC kinds of tests. Are those good tests of English ability? TOEFL, TOEIC tests, are those good tests of English ability?
In terms of what?
Okay. Do they measure actual ability to communicate and write in English? No. Supposedly, but not. How do you get a good score on a TOEFL or TOEIC?
Practice many times. Practice many times.
Practice many times? Or hug one where you learn some techniques, some test-taking techniques to beat the TOEFL or TOEIC. And it's actually easier to do this with the TOEFL or TOEIC than with IELTS. IELTS is more of a difficult test. It's more of a realistic test. Like for IELTS, you actually do an interview with a real person that's recorded. So it's an actual conversation, where with the speaking or listening part of TOEFL or TOEIC, if it's on there, is like really artificial conversations you listen to. Or I think there is a speaking part of for some of these tests where you have some really stupid question. And I've seen some sample questions, like here's a map explaining how to get from the post office to the bank, or reading aloud some passage. And they're really artificial, they're really fake, they have nothing to do with real life, especially with academic English. And many people taking the TOEFL or TOEIC want to use them for business or to get into college or get into grad school. And it has nothing to do with academic English or business English. So there's a big validity problem, I think. I've also seen TOEFL grammar questions that are just really bad because there's no context. One sentence, and they ask you what is the right answer for a grammar structure that requires context. Things like a and the, articles, perfect tense. Or there's something called inverted sentences, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, and that's where you put something else into the front of the verb and the subject goes after the verb. It's an inverted sentence, like into the room sauntered the lazy student. Sauntered means to walk slowly. Pardon? Oh, it's changing now? That's good, because traditionally they had these kinds of grammar questions about grammar structures that require context. They work in so they've gotten rid of that.
But in TOEIC they have grammar questions.
They still have the traditional grammar questions. And those are just really invalid for some of the grammar structures that depend on context. Inverted sentences depend on context. Perfect tense, articles, and such depend on context. And so it's not a linguistically valid kind of question. But also, a reason why TOEFL and TOEIC questions are easy to beat is these questions are generated from a template. So at ETS they have these sort of templates or test specifications. It's a specification. Or in the testing field they call it a spec, which is a template. And this template defines, and so they have a bunch of these templates for test questions, and they basically generate multiple questions from the same template. The reading passage may be different, or some things may be different, the sentence may be different. But basically they have a template that says this question is testing for this particular thing. Maybe it's perfect tense or a particular kind of reading comprehension skill. And the template defines what the question will look like, what it's used with, like it's used with the reading comprehension selection, or it's used with the grammar item select questions. And it's going to specify what the correct answer will look like and what the incorrect answers will look like. So they have incorrect answers, they call them distractors. So in testing, the incorrect answer is called a distractor. It's designed to distract you. And so ETS uses these test templates, and the template specifies what the distractors will look like, in what way the distractors will be wrong. And so if you take the TOEFL repeatedly, or the TOEIC, or if you go to a Hagwon and learn these techniques, basically you're learning to break the template, you're learning to crack the template. You're learning to kind of predict, okay, this is a question about inverted sentences, so I can guess now. It's a question about inverted sentences. I know what they're looking for. I know what the distractors are going to look like, so I can guess the right answer because I know I can kind of back engineer, reverse engineer the template.
How different is that template from IGMAC? we call it item bank, because there are so many items, and you choose according to the template, or?
Item bank, maybe similar. Item bank sounds familiar. I don't know where I've heard it.
Item bank, I think it's usually...
Item bank. Oh, item bank, yeah. It's like an item bank. So they have a bank, a whole collection of, an item bank, a whole collection of different templates. And these templates will generate questions every time. So they'll basically create, every time they need new test questions, they'll just go to the templates and create one from their templates. And whenever you take a TOEFL or TOEIC test, most of the questions that you do are used to calculate your score, but there are some questions that are not used to calculate their score. They're new questions that they have developed, and they're basically collecting test data on these questions. And depending on the statistical reliability of people's responses to these test questions, they'll make it an actual test question in a future exam that will be counted. So they're kind of doing research on you. You're paying them, what is it, $100 now or $150? How much is it? To do research on you, because some of the questions are just for their own, it's a pilot question. They're testing some new questions to be used in a future exam. They make all this money, and ETS doesn't pay taxes. Did you know that? Because it is a research institute that belongs to Princeton University. They make hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and they pay no taxes. That's a great scam. I should start my own test-taking company and say it's a research institution and I don't have to pay taxes. So that's why I refer to ETS as the evil testing service. Anyway, and a lot of their test, the way they design this test is driven by statistics, not necessarily linguistic concerns. In fact, a lot of the people who work for ETS are statisticians. Some of them are linguists, but they have kind of limited linguistic experience, maybe a master's in TESOL, and that's it. They don't have a lot of real linguists, fully trained linguists, doing their testing design. Anyway, so back to this. So you can see there are problems with traditional tests that we want to get away from. Some other problems, and I'll talk about ways of grading that will also help you to design better tests and assignments in a few minutes. There's also question number 1 here, starting questions. So let's say you're starting to teach a new class, and you don't know if really all of the students have enough background knowledge. Maybe the past semester you taught the class, or another class you had a bad experience because you realized some students were not ready to take my class. They didn't have enough background knowledge, or they hadn't taken the prerequisite course, and they should not have been in my class. Or they really had troubles. So you're starting a new semester. What's a way of finding out if your students in your new class, start of the semester, really have enough background knowledge for your class, and whether or not you have to provide some extra support for them, some extra services, or tell them, hey, take Professor Jones's class first, then take my class? So how can you find out if students really have enough background knowledge, or find out what their problems are? Maybe they have some misunderstandings about some basic concepts that you might need to address. How do you find out?
Diagnosis test. Diagnosis test. Okay.
And you know this stuff, diagnostic test. So sometimes I've encountered professors with this problem, a diagnostic test. So you might want to, like during the first week, either in class or outside of class online, have them do a diagnostic test to test especially more open-ended or problem-solving type questions, which will give you a better idea. So open-ended questions, essay questions, problem-solving questions for any test are better. And also for diagnostic test, it will give you some idea. Do they have enough background? Are there some problems with their understanding of basic concepts that maybe I need to address during the first couple of weeks? Or say you need to do some review, you need to read this textbook before you start doing assignments in my class, outside tutorials or something, just so you identify what their problems are. You might try diagnostic tests. Another problem here in number 3, you have a lot of assignments to grade. And especially maybe essay questions, research papers, essays, problem-solving type questions, and it's a lot of grading work. How can you simplify your grading life? How to simplify your grading work?
I need to make a rubric out to a right and a grade to be all the passages.
Okay. So one is rubrics, which we'll get to in a minute. And before rubrics, what might be something else that would help grading, make your grading more efficient? Of course, you could say multiple choice questions. Those are easy to grade. That's probably why a lot of professors like multiple choice questions. They're easy to grade, but they're not really good test items. What might be some other ways of conveniently grading a lot of stuff, especially essay questions, problem-solving questions, and such?
Basically, classify students in essays, okay, because you read it through and, divide, classify them.
Okay.
Excellent, blah, blah.
Sometimes when I'm grading essays, I actually kind of divide them into stacks. These are the really good ones, maybe A+, and medium and such. Especially for writing teachers. Writing teachers will do this. Writing teachers also have some jokes. They'll say, oh, I'll just, here's a collection of essays for my students. I'll just throw them along the stairs and grade them according to where they land on the stairs. Or throw them in front of a fan and grade them according to where they land. Those are writing teachers' jokes. Of course, we don't really do that. Of course, nowadays you can just get an electronic scale and weigh them and, okay, 93. Okay. Another thing that I have done is, let's say I'm grading essays, a batch of essays, and pretty much the same kinds of good points and the same kind of problems are going to come up repeatedly with a batch of essays. So I'll just kind of write down some of my responses, my comments, in maybe a document or a spreadsheet, and it'll be sort of like a grading database. And I can keep these on hand for the next assignment or the next semester when I do this assignment again. And I can just have sort of a collection of comments, because usually it's going to be the similar kind of problems, mistakes that they make, or similar good things I want to say. And I'll just copy and paste it into an email to the student or into a printed document that I'll provide the student. Personalize it a little bit, of course, after I paste it in there. But it's sort of a grading database. And that's one way of kind of making grading easier, like for essay questions and open-ended stuff, where you need to give more open-ended comments. You don't have to type the same sentence over and over. Just copy and paste it into your feedback to each student. Now, a really good thing, though, is rubrics. So what are rubrics? And by the way, later on, I'm going to show you some technology that will also make all of this stuff easier. It's not on the handout, but I'll show you some technology, some wonderful stuff from Google to help you. But what are rubrics? Okay, directions.
Criteria.
Criteria?
It's kind of an evaluation sheet.
Yeah, it's like an evaluation sheet. Okay, so why are rubrics good for grading? What are advantages of rubrics?
Because you can be fair to every student. You follow the standard
Yeah, so you can make it more objective, more fair to all the students. Assuming your rubric criteria are objective and fair and reasonable, of course, you can use the same criteria and use it to objectively grade students fairly and such. What are other advantages of rubrics? As you see, for example, some sample rubrics in this handout, what would be some other advantages that you would see?
kind of we can provide evidence, how students how much they have achieved, because without this kind of evidence or rubric or something like that, students come to us later. So could you show me the evidence? Oh, sorry, what? And then we have some evidence to prove that.
Okay. Because sometimes students want to know why you gave them a C or a B, and this gives some objective evidence, justification, rationale for their grade, and in that case they probably don't need to come to you as often, especially here where it's competitive, and students will say, why didn't I get an A+? And I'm like, why can't you be happy with an A? An A is good. An A is very good. Why do you need an A+? So you can justify your grades. I mean, as long as your rubric criteria are fair and well developed, of course, you can justify your grade to the student. Secondly, you can also give feedback. The student can understand why he or she got a B+, why he or she didn't get an A. And it gives more specific feedback. I mean, giving specific feedback is, typing it or writing it is really tiring, but this is a very efficient and easy and quick way of giving the student more detailed feedback. So you can show them what you did well and what you didn't do well, what mistakes did you make, what do you need to improve on. And that's where a well-written rubric can be good. You can use it to indicate what they need to work on, because when you give feedback, students want to know what did they do well. They want to know why they didn't do well, what mistakes they made, and how can I do better? How can I improve? And a well-designed rubric with good criteria descriptions can help you to provide better feedback to students. Now in the first example, there aren't really any descriptions. This is maybe appropriate for a very short assignment, a very minor assignment. It's just rating on a scale of 1 to 10. We often call it a Likert scale. Likert is kind of the term in social sciences and statistics. A Likert scale is a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or whatever. But this is easy to subtotal and give back to your students, and it gives them at least a little bit of feedback. Oh, they did really well in the introduction, but the support was poor. And if it's for other assignments, then you could develop some particular criteria. What would be the criteria for an A for a good introduction and thesis? So you could write a more detailed description here for what would be a good A+ paper in terms of what your expectations are for intro, for organization, and for evidence and support. So you could put that into the rubric, and you could print it out or email it to them. And you can, if it's a printout especially, you can highlight things, like you did well here. So it's just simple, you like circling, underlining, highlighting things, or drawing X's, no, you did bad there, if you write out detailed criteria. So you can write out just criteria for what is a good A+ paper, or you can do a more complicated one. This is now this takes a lot of time, but this will save time later on, because you've got detailed descriptions of what is an A+, A-, B+, B, B-, or maybe just A, B, C, whatever. So you've got detailed criteria for, what is an A paper in terms of organization, content, evidence, support. This is a rubric for grading essays, compositions, kind of freshman or undergraduate level. So you could do a very detailed rubric like this. Again, it takes time at first, but later on it saves time, and I can just highlight things. You did well here, you did poorly here, and such. And you can score these, like on this one you could just score it 1 to 10, add them up, no problem. Here you can assign points and add them up and then scale them to 100, and such. So you could score these or evaluate more holistically, but ideally you could have like numerical criteria. Okay, you get maybe 2, 3, 4. So maybe like you got 20 points here, you got 18 points here, you got 17 points here, blah, 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 add it up and convert it to a 100-point scale or something like that. Maybe there's a total of 80 points, and maybe You could either work your rubric so that everything adds up to 100 points or 10 points, or if it adds up to 80 points and they got 78 out of 80, okay, that gives them their score. By the way, when you're grading, and let's say you gave a tough assignment and most everybody did really bad, and you don't want to put a bunch of C's and D's into your grade book. So this is an old trick I learned from my high school physics teacher. There's sort of a grade curve you can do, and this is a really cool formula. Let's say x is the grade, take the square root, multiply it by 10, and it curves them up. And so the worse they did, the more of a boost they got. So you can see if they got a 64, that's going to go to an 80. If they got a 100, okay, if they got a 96, it's going to go up maybe 1 or 2, maybe 1 point, maybe 2 points. So 96 will go to 98. So if they did pretty good already, they just get a little bit of a boost. If they did poorly, if they got a 64, it'll go to an 80. Let's say they got a 49, it'll scale up to 70. So it gives them more of a boost. So it creates a better distribution. So, and you can do little variations on that, but I found that this works the best if you need to curve grades up, especially in science and engineering, where sometimes stats courses where students, you might have a really bad distribution on a particular assignment or exam. So that's a cool way of curving grades up. And of course you can do this in Excel or Google. You know, the Google search box also works as a calculator. In case you didn't know that, you can just type it directly, math equations, into the Google search bar, and it will give you the result too, in case you don't have a calculator handy. And that is like 97. For that, use the caret sign and raise it to a power of 0.5, and 10. You'd use kind of basic syntax like that in Google if you're used to syntax like that. The caret sign means raised to a power. They raise it to 0.5 for a square root. Now, let's say I have some of these criteria, but I'm not an English teacher, I'm not a language teacher. Maybe I'm teaching biology, but I'm teaching biology here at Code, and I'm teaching in English. And they have to write their essay questions in decent English, but English is maybe not my main concern. So maybe English is not as important, like the grammar and spelling and such. It's not as important to me as whether they can express their ideas and provide support and use proper source citations and show understanding of the field. So how could I do my rubric in that case? What would be a fair one?
You can give more weight to other criteria. For example, in English education, we have to include like grammar mistakes or whatever. But your case, you have to get rid of the grammar. Instead, you have to give more weight to like something else.
Yes. Yes. And so here on page 3, you see an example of a weighted rubric. And if you do this in a spreadsheet, this is something it's a little more complicated. You probably have to do it in a spreadsheet, or at least a calculation. And I'll show you how to do that easily in a few minutes. So you could weight like the main, like the more concept-related stuff, content-based stuff is 20%. If it's a presentation, maybe just their speaking skills and time management are less important, but I want to include it, but I want to give it less weight. Or if it's an essay, maybe like your main criteria are 20%, 20%, 20%, but then something like English ability, English expression, that's 10%. So you could break up your rubric like that. You could also break it up into categories, like coherence is 20%, and maybe 5% of that is transitionals. How they use transitional words, on logical flows, maybe 10%. So you could have subcategories too. It gets more complicated, but you can do that in a spreadsheet fairly well. I'll show you a little bit later also how to do this in a Google spreadsheet, a Google form, and such. So you can use weighted rubrics. I'm not going to have you do this right now, but if you want to, you can think on your own, how would you design rubrics? The criteria, the way you word your criteria, let's say for contents, you probably want to have some description under contents, like what are your expectations of contents? Kind of like what you see here on page 2, there are detailed descriptions of what your expectations are. Again, you can do this really complicated where you have expectations for different levels, or just in general say, these are my expectations for the contents of an A+ paper. But you want to put that into your rubric. And so you probably want to design your rubric so that you're focusing more on some of these more cognitively, more advanced kinds of abilities like you see here in the middle, page 3. So you don't want just a rubric that says how well can they regurgitate facts, like who wrote what year did this happen, who discovered this, but more concepts and understanding. So the assignments or the essays, the homework or the exams for which you're going to use this ideally should be looking at least comprehension, questions that show whether they really understand the concepts. Like for example, can you explain to me in just plain English Einstein's general theory of relativity? Explain in your own words. Or explain in your own words what metaphor is. Or explain in your own words how did Shakespeare use metaphor in his sonnets. So comprehension. And next might be application. Okay, we've learned the quadratic equation, we've learned Maxwell's equations. Explain how you would apply this to this kind of situation. So application, problem-solving questions or analytical questions kind of together. Solve a problem and explain how you solved it, or explain your answer. Or if you give like ABC, explain why you chose your answer. 5, synthesizing concepts and information. This is a bit more advanced. Kind of pose them open-ended questions where they have to creatively draw from different things they've learned in the class and in their background knowledge to kind of give you a good answer, a good reason. And critiquing and evaluating. So for example, a good example might be a case study kind of problem where you give them some kind of a case, an actual case. Say medical example, here's the case of a 65-year-old patient. These are his symptoms. These are his blood pressure and stats and the results of his blood test, and his lipids and all of that. What's the correct diagnosis for his symptoms? These are his symptoms. What's the correct diagnosis? So it could be a medical case. There's more of there's one specific correct answer. That's more of a closed-ended kind of question. It could be a little more open-ended. Here's a case study of a business, a particular company. Why did this company, here's a history of this company, why did this company succeed, or why did this company fail, or explain the problems in this company's business model. So that's a little more open-ended. You give them a historical, here's a historical event, analyze this event, what went wrong, what happened. Things like that, problem-solving kinds of questions. So these kinds of skills are probably better. It's going to be better if your assessments, your homework assignments, your exams are getting at some of these more higher order, what we call higher order, that is more cognitive kinds of stuff, not just knowledge recall. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about group activities, and some of these group activities are designed, or active learning or interactive learning activities are designed to promote more cognitive engagement with the material. Likewise, so you get some ideas there. There are also ideas in the handout. Now, here's another problem. 2 related problems actually. One is, I give a lecture, I think I explain things really well. At the end of the class, though, did students really understand what they are supposed to have learned? How do you know? I mean, you don't want to wait until the midterm exam to find out they did not understand anything. So you want to find out, like, after each lecture, did they understand? Maybe a pop quiz at the end, okay. Although often the way traditional quizzes are, they're often the kind of knowledge recall questions. Okay, here's this is actually a related problem. You want the students to read their assignment, maybe the chapter, before class. Maybe tomorrow you're going to give a lecture on thermodynamics or literary metaphor or connectionism and language acquisition or standard deviation statistics, whatever it is. You want them to have read something so that they're ready for you to lecture on it the next day, but they're not reading the chapter before class. How can you get them to read the chapter and find out also if they're understanding it?
Short tests, mini tests. Usually, many professors do that before they before we begin classes. Actually, it's a mini test, very short, less than 10 minutes.
Okay, at the beginning of class?
Yes.
Okay, you can do it at the beginning of class. Now, what if you don't have enough time in class, though, to do a mini class, either a mini test, either before your lecture, after they're supposed to read the material, or after your lecture you want to see if they understood, but you don't have time in class? What's something else you can do? Okay, so a response paper. So there's the pre-class response paper where they're supposed to have read something before your lecture, and you get them to do a response paper before the lecture, or after the lecture, a sort of a short response paper to see if they understood that. And when email came along, we could do this by email, which kind of saves class time because now you can make them do it outside of class. And that's one good thing. You can just do it simply by email. But then you've got maybe 30 emails to grade.
It is formative assessment because while you are teaching, you can test your students. Just ask a question to some individual students.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so this gets into what's called formative assessment. So these kinds of response papers, or response, kind of short response, emails or papers, either before the lecture or after the lecture. It's called formative because one, it helps to form or build their understanding because they have to answer a question. That in itself helps to form their understanding or comprehension. But it also gives you information on whether they're understanding. Are they understanding the readings that they're supposed to do before class? Or after the lecture, are they understanding the lecture? And you get feedback on whether or not they understood it. Now, ideally, you want to have, if it's a pre-class formative assessment, you want to have that information in time before your lecture so that in your lecture you can address these problems that they're having. You find out what problems they're having and address it in your lecture. Or at the end of lecture, collect the data, quickly analyze it, grade it maybe, so that the next class you can say, okay, you all were having difficulty with this. And that's called formative assessment. And so nowadays we can do this online, electronically, either through EKU. So there's a quiz function in something like EKU or other course management software that allows you to do this, including pre-class response papers. Or it's not necessarily a paper, it can be sort of a short quiz. Or after class, you can do this online through EKU. And I'm going to show you how to use Google Docs in a few minutes to do this. But there's some sample formative assessment questions that you might use, and it's a short response. It's usually an open-ended short response question. You could do multiple choice, but if it's like a pre-class response paper, they can kind of cheat. They could share the answer. Okay, what did you put for the answer? Oh, I put B. Okay. So in order to avoid cheating, if you do multiple choice, you should have a follow-up where they have to explain in their own words. And if they're cheating, if they're copying, it's going to be obvious that they copied a response from a classmate. But you can do this online. And there's some questions here like, what did you understand? What was the main thing you got from the reading? Or what did you not understand from the assigned reading? Or what did you not understand from today's lecture? What questions do you still have after my lecture about this topic? Kind of what's the muddiest point, what you didn't understand? Or explain today, what was the main concept of chapter 6? Or what was the main concept from my lecture? Explain this in your own words. Or some kind of a conceptual question. Today we learned about X. How would X apply to a case like Y? Application questions. Do you agree with what you read or what we talked about in class today. What was the main point of my lecture? Or what were the main points? Or what did you learn from today's lecture? Some kind of question like that. And so those are kinds of formative assessment questions. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you how to do this in Google Docs. It's actually convenient too. You can also do it in EKU, but of course, EKU I find inconvenient. I've never actually used it. It is a little clunky and inconvenient. And of course, you might go on to another school where they use a different system. But nowadays, Google Docs has something better. Before we do that, though, when it comes to giving feedback, I want to briefly talk about feedback. When you're giving feedback to students, of course, rubrics are one way of giving feedback. That's very easy. But if you are writing out or typing individual comments to a student, what are good kinds of feedback and what are poor kinds of feedback? Now we have more people here, so this will work now. Maybe talk to a partner and talk about what are effective kinds of feedback and not helpful kinds of feedback. What kind of feedback would you want from a professor, or what kind of feedback should you give to a student? So talk to a partner for a minute or 2 minutes. Finished? Okay. All right, let's come back together. And what were your thoughts about feedback, good and bad feedback to students?
I think to give some details is better.
Okay, some detail. Yeah, not just good, bad, or just sucked. No, definitely not good. Some detail, reasonable details. You have some like more specific ideas about details? What kind of details you want to give to students?
I want to know about. I want to know whether I am on the right track or not, and what is my weakness or.
Okay. So specific details about what was good and what was not good and what you need to do to improve, what needs work, what needs improvement.
So I'd like to add just some more things to her opinions. Actually, we discussed together. Because when I just wrote some essays, to the professor, actually, some professors, only about the question mark, unclear. So what is unclear and the question mark. So, and actually, as a student, we want them to give me in details. So what is, not what is unclear here? So which direction should I go? And some kind of that kind of stuff we need as a student. But as a professor, we don't want to give a lot of in detail like comments because time consuming. So like our positions are quite different, opposites. I want more as a student, but as a professor, I don't want to give some more. That kind of stuff.
Yes.
Actually,
Yeah. And one little thought on writing comments is in grading essays, I have a system of abbreviations, and I give them a list at the start of the semester. Like these in grading, these are symbols I use. Awk means grammatically awkward, and CS means a comma splice, and like I have a whole list of symbols and abbreviations I use that they have. Okay. Other thoughts?
I always begin with positive feedback because I feel uncomfortable getting feedback from teachers.
Okay.
That negative feedback might make them, not want to write anything.
Okay. So definitely you need to give some positive feedback, comment on things that they did well. And it needs to be something specific. Is it a good idea just to say, but you're really good in English, or you're really smart? That is a kind of ability feedback, which is very vague. Just, oh, but you're really smart, or your English is good. That's ability feedback, which is kind of like, one is kind of like comparing them. So whether you say, oh, but you're really smart, it's, or your English is terrible, and that's ability feedback, which is not specific. It's not something that they can act on. It doesn't tell them exactly what was good or what was bad. It's very vague, and it's not helpful because they're not going to know what specifically they should feel good about or what specifically they need to work on. And again, it's also like social, it can be like comparing, either directly or implied. It's like comparing them with other students. It's social comparison, and we talked about that some weeks ago, how social comparison is not good for motivation or for students. And positive feedback is also especially important for students who have maybe been hurt. They've been hurt by the educational system, by too much pressure in the past from parents or teachers that have ruined their motivation, that have hurt their self-esteem, or they have self-esteem problems, or they have fallen into sort of a learned helplessness where they just feel like it doesn't matter how hard I try, teacher, I can't do well, teacher doesn't like me. And so that's why it's important to give detailed, positive information, and also details about what specifically they did wrong and what specific things they could do to improve. Because if you don't, especially if the student has self-esteem problems, motivation problems, they're going to feel like, oh, the teacher just doesn't like me, or I don't have a chance in this class, I'm dumb, I'm never going to do well at this topic. So it's important to give specific feedback. I remember my first semester of grad school, I took a syntactic theory course, and the teacher was a bad lecturer, a bad teacher, had a bad attitude. And we had to do these analytical papers, and supposedly we could revise them as much as we wanted to turn them in for a chance at a better grade. But every time I revised mine, she gave it a worse grade. And of course the best grade got recorded in the grade book. So, but it was like never ending, because every time I handed in a new version, the criteria suddenly were much higher. She was very arbitrary about the criteria, and she never told us what she expected. But every time I tried to do a revision, somehow the grading criteria were suddenly much higher. And one time she wrote, "This is nonsense." Okay, but she didn't tell me what exactly was wrong with my statement. That's just really bad. So especially students who have self-esteem problems and such. And that's where rubrics can be helpful, because you can use a rubric to point out what specific things they did well. You should feel good because your vocabulary choice was pretty good here, or you had really good evidence or support here for this statement. And you can use rubrics or specific comments, whether or not you use rubrics, to point out what specific things they missed, what specific things they need to do to improve. Like here, your use of evidence and sources was weak, you need more sources, more evidence, or this statement is kind of too general, you need to focus this better, you need to reformulate these arguments better, something specific like that. And some specific suggestions they can act on in order to improve. Like you might want to review that chapter or some content, the particular section from the previous course, or you might want to look at such and such, and give them something specific to do or to look at, or a specific place to go for some extra help, so they know this is what I can do to improve. So give them particular suggestions for improvement, if possible or if relevant. So in other words, actionable feedback, what we call actionable feedback, something that they can act on, something they can do something about. If I just tell you, oh, your English is good, or oh, your English was terrible, that's not something you can act on or do anything about. It might just discourage you, or you might feel like, oh, the teacher's just saying that to be nice, I don't know. Or the teacher's too busy to give me proper feedback. But if you give them specific feedback and suggestions on what to do to improve, those are helpful things. And I think if you look at this, again, on the website, you can get the full version of this. This is on the website, and there's some more examples in here. I might have something else I can put on the website. Now, we have some time left. So could you turn off one of the lights, Sunny? Now, for giving feedback, let me show you some electronic tricks. One thing is, let's say if it's an essay or a write-up, you can have this, some ways of saving you some time and making things efficient. If the student has a Gmail account, you can say, if possible, write your document in a Google Doc and send me the link. And of course, you know, the student can come here and share it. So let's say this is the student's paper. This is just pretend. The student has emailed me a link. So this is my email account. So let me see here. I'll go here. It'll open up. Okay, so now I've got the student's copy. The student, of course, has to enable editing. When you share, you have to enable the permissions can comment. So let's go back. This is what I see on my computer, my email. Now I can use the comments, and I can just put comments here. This is a terrible essay. Now, of course, this is probably not good feedback, but let's say, I'll just say, maybe F. Maybe I'll be nice, give an F+. So great. This is just, of course, in reality, you would want to give more appropriate feedback, but comment. And it should show up here on the student's version pretty soon. Like I said, it should, you can chat. For some, it should show up here on the student's version. I'm not sure why it isn't, but maybe I have to, okay, turn it on. Okay, now I can see it here. So if you have students turn in assignments through Google Docs, for example, I can comment on it. I can put my comment here. And the student is going to get it right away, immediately, automatically. I don't have to email it or do anything. It shows up on the student's version, as long as the student has given me the ability to comment or edit when sharing it with me. So that's one thing you can have students do, is to turn in things through Google Docs, share the link with you, and give you the power to comment or edit. And you can just type it in, and they automatically get what you've written. It's just automatic. It's instant. Other things, Google Forms. I don't know if you use Google Forms. Let me see, where's the one I want? Yeah. Okay, so let's say I need to grade papers for 30 or 60 students. I can use a Google form to do this. And of course, if you have Microsoft Office, you may know about mail merges. If you know a mail merge, you can use word processing software to, like a spreadsheet, to kind of write responses and email it out to people. You can do the same thing now in Google Docs, and it's a little easier because it's through your Gmail account. And for this, students don't have to have Gmail, just you. So in this case, let's say I'll just copy and paste the roster into here. They're the students' names and email accounts, maybe 2 email accounts just in case of an email problem. And so this is feedback on a homework assignment. Can you all see this? Okay, so question 1 on their assignment, I'll write in some comments, and of course it should be a little more detailed than this. This is just pretend. Question 2, here's my, this is on a score, I'm just giving them feedback on a scale of 1 to 10. By the way, for formative assessment, by the way, you can, there's some, I'll put some more stuff on the website, or it's in that book, might be in that booklet. For formative assessments, I grade on a scale of 1 to 10. Each one is a minor assignment worth 10 points, and I give them a rubric for that, and it's partly for effort as well as, it's not necessarily whether it's right or wrong, because I usually give open-ended questions. So I grade them based on effort as well as, and not just correctness. Especially for open-ended questions. But anyway, I can give them 8 and 8, and it's a spreadsheet, so a formula will calculate it. Okay, now let's say I've got this for 30 students. I can have my Google form email the feedback to the students. And to do this, you're going to go to Tools, and go to script gallery. Now, people have written scripts to extend the functionality of Google Forms for things like this. And you see here Doctopus. I'm not going to show you Doctopus. It was created for educational purposes. It's kind of complicated, and I haven't had much luck getting it to work, but it does offer you some more complicated features. It's a little more complicated to use. I'm going to use a simpler one, and it's called Form Emailer. So I'll just search for Form Emailer, one word. And this will do email feedback. So I'm going to click Install. It takes a minute. Okay, then authorize it and close. Now it's showing up here on my menu bar. Now I need to, I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. Yes. Form Emailer. Then I need to install again here. It's a little jump through hoops, but after this it'll work. Okay, install again. So it's just installing it specifically to the spreadsheet. Okay, the script shows up. Let me go back to my main sheet. Now, it's going to show you the status afterwards. I've got these comments. I'm going to send them to the student. Then I'm going to go to Form Emailer again, look at the settings. And this is what the email is going to look like. Now there's a little HTML script here, but you don't need to be afraid. I don't know if you can see it, but there's BR, that means a line break. This is what the body of the email will look like. B and then /B, boldfaces it, and the /B, there's a /B, it turns it off. It's fairly simple HTML though, you can figure it out. I don't need all of this stuff here. You can also use P for paragraph. Now I'm going to put in a CC. And actually I want to CC it back to myself. So it'll be in my mailbox. And, or actually I'll put in a, I'm going to do this. With Gmail addresses you can put a plus sign and then something after a plus sign. And it'll go to your, it's your email account, but then you can set up a filter. It still goes to your email account, but you can also set up a filter. So my filter will say if an email comes in with my email address plus E, it goes to a certain box. It could be plus whatever, but you plus something. And I'll set up a filter in my Gmail account because I get a lot of other stuff in my inbox. So this will direct it to another box, a separate inbox for my class or my classes. So go to my inbox for my English class. That's why I chose plus E. Now I'm going to put in a variable for the student's email. It'll go to their email. Now this is case sensitive, so it's # and then whatever the header is on your spreadsheet. You can't see it, but on your spreadsheet it's the column header is email. So it's case sensitive, so be careful whether it's big E or little e. So it's # and the name of that header, the column header, and # for the variable. Just like here, it's going to be like Q1 comments, #, Q1 comments, #, that #. And I could put something in the email. I could say dear, and then name, #. And I'll change that to a P because I want a paragraph break. P means paragraph. Doesn't matter. Here is feedback. Okay, and I don't really need to put in some of this stuff, but it'll get their comments and their evaluations and then the final grade for the assignment. And I'm done with setting it up. And now I'm ready to email all of this stuff out to my 30 or 60 students. So now I go process manually. And I'm starting with line 2 until the end, or I could specify a particular line if I just want to send it to one particular student from 2 to the end, 2*, okay. And it's been sent. There's maybe some little problem with my syntax, but it doesn't matter. And we go to my inbox, and it should go there in a minute. But And it's not there yet, but it should go there in a minute. So that's a way of mass mailing comments and feedback to a bunch of students. Allow me to go over time. Let me show you something else with Form Emailer. For formative assessment or other assignments, I can also have them submit the information through a Google form. So if you have a spreadsheet, this is a different spreadsheet, you can go to Tools and start a form, and I've already set up a form. And so you can set up a form from your Google spreadsheet, and this is what my form looks like. I've already set it up. I collect their name. The star means it's required name, email. I usually ask for 2 separate email addresses. I usually have 2 different fields for 2 different emails because sometimes Gmail doesn't communicate with Korean mail servers and emails get lost. So usually I have 2. This is a question 1, question 2, and you can see here you can edit, and there are different types of questions you can choose. A text, a paragraph for more open-ended, or discussion, multiple choice, a scale like a Likert scale, check boxes, whatever, a grid which is kind of like a Likert scale for several things at once. You can make it a required question so they have to answer it and they can't submit it until they've done it. Then you can either get a URL for the form, and you can email them the URL and say, hey, do this form like this, or you can just put the email addresses for all of your students here and email it to them. And they're going to get the form in their email or a link to it, and they can click on the link if it doesn't show up. And they don't have to have Gmail to do this. You're just sending them a link to an online form. They can fill it out. I don't know. And submit. So it gets submitted. And it's going to show up automatically here. So their responses are here. It gives a timestamp so you know when they submitted it, and you can penalize them if it was late. So you've got it, and you can do the same thing. You can add some fields like for your comments in the score and evaluation, and you can then use this you can use the form emailer then to email back to them your comments from the form, or copy and paste it to a separate sheet in the same spreadsheet. So you can use this, you can use an online form to do formative assessments or smaller assignments, and then you can use the same form with the form emailer to then email responses, feedback, and grades back to them. And this has really made teaching really easy for me for grading and doing formative assessment. Short assignments. You can also collect anonymous. If you exclude the email field, you can, if you want them to say, okay, midterm or end of the class, give me some anonymous feedback on my course. How's my course doing? What would you like me to do different? I use that for that purpose too, for collecting anonymous course feedback. So any questions? If not, just look for Form Emailer. So you set up your Google spreadsheet, and you can look, there's some scripts like Form Emailer. You can Google them and find some information on how to set them up and how to use them and such, but it's fairly easy. There's, like I said, another one called Doctopus, which is kind of harder to use, and I haven't really used it, but it gives you some more functionality and such. And so these scripts that people have created provide some nice functionality to Google Forms and spreadsheets. So next week there's no session, but if you're a grad student who has signed up for the certificate and you want to do the certificate this semester, I think we've sent you an email asking you to sign up for a small group workshop either next week or the following week. And bring your CV at least. And so we'll have some discussion and such about your CV and about professional development, maybe conference presentations and such. 2 weeks, we'll meet back here for another workshop on group activities, how to use group activities, different kinds of group activities. So see you either at my small group workshop or in 2 weeks. And if you're a grad student and you haven't done a survey yet, you can get a survey back there. Bring it back to us for a 5001 gift certificate for grad students if you haven't done it yet. Thank you, and see you later.